Okay, so are you ready to dive into this? We've got a fascinating mix of finance, tech, and even some politics.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy how all these sources we've got. I mean, you've got CNBC Crypto World, statements from Trump, and even like experts talking about his policies, and then we've got this eulogy for Jimmy Carter. I mean, it's a lot.
It is a lot, but it's
Yeah.
really interesting to see how they all connect.
Mhm.
And actually, what's really interesting? Did you know that a state senator in Oklahoma actually wants to pay state employees with Bitcoin?
It's interesting, right? And then you have Jimmy Carter. He played a role in almost like getting rid of this really bad disease.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here, that's for sure. But I think it's going to be a really interesting deep dive. So let's start with Oklahoma. There's this state senator, right?
Right.
And he's pushing this Bitcoin Freedom Act thing.
Yeah, so basically it would give state employees the option to be paid in Bitcoin.
Okay, so is this like I don't know, a sign of things to come? Like, are we going to start seeing Bitcoin everywhere?
Well, I mean, it definitely ties into this whole national trend. More and more people are starting to see Bitcoin as a way to protect themselves from inflation, right? Remember when Trump was campaigning? He was really big on Bitcoin.
Right. And then there's all this talk about, like, the government hoarding Bitcoin.
Exactly. It's like that whole in Bitcoin we trust idea is becoming a reality. But, it's not that simple. Like, is Bitcoin really a mainstream solution? And can it actually protect us from inflation like the senator claims?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we all know that Bitcoin can be super volatile.
Exactly. And this ties into everything that's going on with inflation and the Fed right now, which we'll get into later. But the bottom line is Bitcoin is a risky investment.
For sure. Okay, so let's move on to something a little less volatile, maybe. How about that billion-dollar real estate deal that just went down on the blockchain?
Yeah, this is really cool.
Tell me more.
So there's this UAE firm, D, and they just made this huge deal with Mantra, this blockchain platform that's focused on real-world assets. Basically, they're tokenizing real estate.
Tokenizing. Can you explain that? Like, what does that even mean?
Sure. Imagine you're taking something like a Bitcoin, right? And you're turning it into a digital representation on the blockchain. So you're basically turning it into these digital tokens that people can buy and sell.
Okay, but like, what's the point of that? What's the benefit for, say, an investor?
Well, it makes these assets way more accessible. You can buy a tiny piece of a skyscraper in Dubai, for example, all with just a few clicks.
Whoa. Okay, that is pretty cool. So is this part of that whole Web3 thing that everyone keeps talking about?
Absolutely. This deal is a perfect example of how Web3 is pushing the boundaries. And we're seeing big institutions getting involved too, like Standard Chartered, for example. They just announced they're setting up a new entity in Luxembourg that's all about providing custody services for digital assets.
So it's like everyone's jumping on the bandwagon. But what about regulations? Is the U.S. keeping up with all this innovation?
That's where things get a little tricky. The crypto regulatory landscape here in the US is, well, it's kind of like a moving target. There's a
Yeah.
lot of talk about both overregulation and underregulation, which is causing a lot of confusion.
Yeah, so which is it? Too many rules or not enough?
Honestly, it seems like it depends on who you ask. So, Young Kim, this finance professor at Santa Clara University, pointed out something really interesting. He said that Coinbase had to shut down their whole crypto lending program because regulators considered it a security. But then you've got all these similar lending protocols operating in DeFi, like totally unregulated.
Wait, so it's like the rules are being applied differently depending on the situation. What's going on here?
It seems like a big part of the problem is that regulators are still trying to wrap their heads around the technology,
Yeah.
and how it actually works in the real world. All this uncertainty is making it harder for the industry to grow in a responsible way.
Yeah, I get that. It's got to be tough to regulate something that's constantly changing.
Right. Kim gave a great example, actually. There's this rule where businesses have to report large crypto transactions, kind of like they do for cash. But the thing is, the rule wasn't clear about how it applied to different types of wallets, so a lot of businesses were left wondering what they were supposed to do.
Oh, wow. So it's like, how can you follow the rules if you don't even know what they are?
Exactly. And this is where other countries are kind of pulling ahead. Places like Switzerland and Dubai, they've taken a much more proactive approach. They're creating clear guidelines that are actually attracting businesses and helping the crypto industry grow.
Hmm. Maybe the U.S. can learn a thing or two from them.
For sure. The EU is also doing some interesting things. They've got this new framework, MiCA, that's all about harmonizing regulations across the bloc.
So it sounds like clear, well thought out regulation is key here.
Absolutely. It creates a level playing field, encourages innovation, and ultimately benefits everyone.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so it seems like the U.S. has some catching up to do, but let's switch gears for a sec. There's been a lot of talk about Donald Trump and this potential meeting with Putin. It kind of feels like things could get a little, unpredictable on the world stage.
Yeah, it's definitely something to keep an eye on. Trump made some big promises during his campaign, like ending the war in Ukraine, and now some people are worried about what this meeting could mean.
Especially with all the, history between Trump and Putin.
Exactly. And it's interesting because this comes right after Zelensky voiced some concerns about Trump maybe trying to make a deal that gives Russian some Ukrainian territory.
Oh, wow. So it's like a whole new level of uncertainty.
Yeah, for sure. But I think it's important to remember that the Biden administration has said they're still supporting Ukraine, sending military aid and stuff. So we'll just have to see how things play out.
So a lot of moving pieces there.
Okay.
So moving on to something a little, well, maybe not lighter, but definitely different. This week we also saw the state funeral for Jimmy Carter.
Hmm.
It's amazing to think about all he did during his life. What were some of the big takeaways for you from the eulogies?
One thing that really stood out was how much people talked about Carter's honesty, like his commitment to always telling the truth, even when it was hard. And also his faith. His Christian faith was clearly a big part of his life.
Yeah, he always seemed like a man of principle.
Absolutely. And people kept talking about how down to earth he was, how he could connect with anyone. And of course, there were a lot of stories about his relationship with Rosalind.
It seemed like they had a really special bond.
For sure. Okay, but beyond his personal qualities, I think Carter will also be remembered for his accomplishments, like he did a lot of important work on environmental issues like climate change and conservation.
Yeah, he was talking about climate change way back when most people weren't even thinking about it.
Right. And, he got a lot of criticism for it at the time, but looking back, it's clear that he was ahead of the curve. He also made significant contributions to human rights, both here in the U.S. and internationally. And then, of course, there were the Camp David Accords.
The Camp David Accords, that was huge.
Yeah, I mean, bringing peace between Israel and Egypt, that was a monumental achievement. It really shows what's possible with diplomacy,
Yeah.
how much you can achieve when you bring people together.
Okay, so before we dive into the economic outlook and all that, let's take a quick detour into personal finance. Remember that segment about financial advisors?
Hmm?
What did you think about that?
Oh, yeah. It was a good reminder that not all financial advisors are created equal.
Yeah.
Like, there's a big difference between advisors who work on commission and those who charge a flat fee.
Right, because when an advisor gets paid based on what they sell you, it's like, how can you be sure they're giving you the best advice?
Exactly. With a flat fee, you know they're working for you, not for some big company trying to sell you products.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's get to the economic roller coaster now. What's the forecast looking like for 2025?
It's a bit of a mixed bag, to be honest. There are some good signs, like the stock market is doing really well. But there are also some warning signs.
Like what?
Well, for one, we're seeing more and more companies filing for bankruptcy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then there are these concerns about credit spreads widening, which basically means investors are getting nervous about companies being able to pay back their debts. And we still haven't seen the jobs report yet.
What will the jobs report tell us?
It'll give us a better sense of how the labor market is doing, which is a big factor in inflation. If the report shows strong job growth, it could mean that the economy is actually doing better than people think. But it could also push the Fed to raise interest rates again.
So are we heading for a recession?
That's the million-dollar question. Honestly, it's really hard to say right now, especially with Trump back in the picture. His policies, especially on trade, could really shake things up.
Didn't you mention Germany's already in a recession?
Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. That's right. Germany, which is like the economic powerhouse of Europe, is officially in a recession. So that's definitely a red flag.
Yeah, not good. Okay, so things are a little shaky right now, but what about those micro trends you were talking about? Any bright spots on the horizon?
Absolutely. First up, GameStop. Remember them?
Oh, yeah, the meme stock.
Well, they've been quietly building up a ton of cash, and some analysts think they could be about to make a comeback.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, they've got a strong brand, loyal customers. Who knows? Maybe they'll surprise everyone.
Okay, this next one is a little out there. Humanoid robots.
Yeah, so Elon Musk, always thinking big, right? He thinks humanoid robots are going to be the next big thing. Like, he thinks eventually everyone will have one, maybe even two.
Whoa, that's a lot of robots.
Right. And he even thinks it could lead to a future where everyone has a high income because robots will be doing most of the work.
Hmm, that's an interesting thought. Okay, what about trading cards?
Two things to watch there. First, these NIL deals where college athletes can now make money from their name, image, and likeness are creating a whole new market for trading cards, like pre-rookie
Oh,
cards.
wow, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like getting in on the ground floor. And second, Fanatics is taking over the NBA trading card license.
Not a big deal.
Huge. A lot of people think it's going to cause the value of NBA cards to skyrocket.
Okay, last but not least, the wildfires in California. It's just devastating to see what's happening out there.
Yeah, it's really heartbreaking. Thousands of people have had to evacuate their homes, and the economic cost is already in the billions, and it could get even worse.
And there have been some issues with the response, right?
Yeah, there's been some controversy around the LA Fire Department, their diversity initiatives and stuff. Some people are saying that those initiatives have actually made things worse.
Oh, wow. And what about the infrastructure problems, like the fire hydrants running dry?
Yeah, that's a big issue. It seems like the city hasn't done enough to prepare for these kinds of disasters.
And then there's all the criticism of Governor Newsom.
Yeah, people are saying he hasn't done enough to prevent these fires, or to manage the state's water resources properly.
It seems like these fires have really exposed some deep problems.
It's a tough situation for sure. No easy answers, you
Mm.
know? But I think one thing's for sure, we really need to start thinking seriously about how to, deal with climate change and how to be more prepared for these kinds of disasters in the future.
Yeah, it makes you think about what we were just talking about with Jimmy Carter, right?
Yeah.
Like he was warning about climate change way back when, and nobody was really listening.
It's true, yeah. And people make fun of him for it, But now, here we are, we're seeing the results of not taking it seriously. It just shows you how, I don't know, sometimes politicians focus too much on the short term and not enough on the long term.
Yeah, I guess that's a good lesson for all of us. So after all this, what's the big takeaway for you? Like, what's the one thing you want our listeners to remember from this deep dive?
I think the biggest thing is just realizing that the world is changing really fast, everything's changing. Finance, technology, politics, and it's all happening at the same time. And this creates a lot of, I don't know, opportunities, but also challenges. So I think the key is to stay informed, keep learning, and be ready to adapt. We've seen how even small decisions like a change in regulations or somebody investing in some new tech can have these huge ripple effects that change the whole world.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming to try to keep up with it all.
Totally. But it's also pretty exciting, right? Like, we're living in a time where anything is possible.
That's a good point. It's like we all have a chance to shape the future in a way.
Exactly. The choices we make today will determine what happens tomorrow. So stay curious, stay involved, and keep learning. That's what I would say.
And on that note, I think we'll wrap things up. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll leave you with one final thought. We talked a lot about Jimmy Carter today and how he saw the dangers of climate change before most people. So the question is, how can we learn from his example, and how can we use that knowledge to face the challenges of our own time? It's something to think about.